You probably believe your personality came from your parents, the home you grew up in, choices made around you before you ever had a say. In 1979, a man named Jim Lewis tested that belief without meaning to. He tracked down a brother he'd never met, separated from him since they were 4 weeks old. When the two finally sat in the same room, they found they'd married women with the same name, divorced them the same year, and named their sons almost the exact same thing. Neither man could explain how. Scientists spent the next 2 decades trying to. It's tempting to write that off as a fluke. Flip through enough categories, names, jobs, hobbies, pets, and any two strangers will share something. That's the easy explanation. But the coincidences kept stacking. Both Jims had worked as deputy sheriffs. Both drove the same model Chevrolet. Both bit their fingernails to nothing. Both got tension headaches at the same point in the day. Both smoked the same brand, Salem cigarettes. Both vacationed on the exact same stretch of Florida beach on separate trips, years apart. One named his first son James Allen. The other named his first son James Allen. By the time researchers stopped counting, the two men shared more than 10 specific, independently verified matches. Neither man knew the other existed until he was 39. Word of the Jim twins reached a psychologist at the University of Minnesota named Thomas Bouchard. He had one question: how many more pairs like this were out there, hiding in plain sight, never reunited, never studied? In 1979, he launched what eventually became known as the Minnesota Study of Twins Reared Apart. Over the next 20 years, his team, including David Lycan, Nancy Siegel, Auke Tellegen, and Matthew McGuey, tracked down 137 separated twin pairs. 81 were identical, 56 were fraternal. Each pair flew to Minneapolis at the university's expense for roughly 50 hours of testing across a single week. Personality inventories, IQ tests, full medical exams, brainwave recordings. Interviews on everything from childhood fears to the specific jokes that made them laugh. Zygosity, whether a pair was truly identical, was confirmed with blood typing and fingerprint analysis, not just appearance. One pair had been apart for 77 years before reuniting at age 78, the longest separation ever recorded in a study like this. The pattern held anyway. Pair after pair, the same thing kept happening. Twins raised by families who'd never met scored so closely on the same 100-question personality test that researchers said it looked like one person filling it out twice. Two sisters separated as infants both became compulsive list makers who silently counted their steps on a staircase. Two brothers raised on opposite coasts both became volunteer firefighters within a year of each other, with zero contact between them. A pair of women, raised a continent apart, both arrived for testing wearing 7 rings, on the same hands, in the same arrangement. This wasn't just shared hobbies. It was timing. It was a nervous laugh. It was a throwaway phrase repeated by two people who'd never spoken. By 1990, when Bouchard's team published their results in the journal Science, the data spanned over a decade and was too consistent to call it luck. The world ran with one headline: genes are destiny. Upbringing barely matters. If twins raised 1,000 miles apart by total strangers could turn out this similar, then who you become was decided the moment you were conceived, and everything afterward was just noise. That's the version that gets quoted in classrooms and dinner table arguments about nature versus nurture. It's also not what the data actually said. And here's the part almost nobody mentions when they tell this story. For some traits, the headline wasn't far off. Bouchard's team and the researchers who followed him found that adult IQ was heritable to a striking degree, with later analyses of the same kind of data putting the number closer to 70%. That part genuinely did surprise psychologists who'd assumed upbringing and schooling would dominate. But personality wasn't IQ. Traits like how outgoing you are, how anxious you get, how much you trust strangers, those came back closer to 50% heritable, sometimes lower. The same study that made genetics look all-powerful for one kind of trait was quietly telling a more complicated story about the rest of who a person is. Nobody put that nuance on the headline. Across the personality traits Bouchard's team measured, genetics explained roughly half the differences between people. Half, not nearly all of it. The other half came from environment, full stop. So, which part of the environment? This is where it gets uncomfortable. In 1987, a researcher named Robert Plomin, working with Denise Daniels, published a paper asking something almost nobody had asked directly. Why are children raised in the same house by the same two parents, eating the same dinners, often so different from each other? The answer, built on decades of twin and family data gathered across multiple countries, was almost insulting to anyone who's ever credited their parents for who they became. Being raised in the same house household barely makes siblings more alike at all. Same address, same school district, same arguments at the same dinner table. None of it explains much of the personality gap between two people who grew up under that roof. Not zero, almost none. Whatever was shaping you, it wasn't the part of childhood your whole family lived through together. There's an even less comfortable wrinkle critics have raised about the twin studies themselves. Adoption agencies in that era often matched babies to families of similar background and income without meaning to run an experiment. So even the separate environments weren't always as separate as the headlines made them sound. It's a fair criticism, and Bouchard's team took it seriously. Researchers have spent years trying to account for that overlap in the numbers, and the heritability estimates have held up regardless. The real picture is messier than either side of the nature versus nurture argument wants it to be, and messier is usually closer to true. So if it's not genes alone, and it's not the shared house, what's left? Plomin's own data pointed somewhere specific: birth order, illness, the particular friend a sibling never had, a single year when one child was singled out by a teacher and the other wasn't. The part of your environment that actually built you wasn't experienced as a group. It was the part nobody else in your house ever touched. The teacher who noticed you in 3rd grade for a reason your sibling never registered. The friend group you fell into at 14 while your brother fell into a different one entirely. The summer you broke an arm and spent 6 weeks reading alone in a room, while everyone else in the house went on with a normal August. The conversation you overheard through a wall at an hour nobody else in the house was awake for. An accident. A book. A breakup, a stranger on a long drive. Two children can grow up under the exact same roof, with the exact same parents, and live almost entirely separate lives, because the moments that built each of them were never shared between them at all. That's what the Jim twins prove, from the opposite direction. They never shared a house. They never shared one single moment of childhood. They didn't know the other one existed until they were 39 years old. And yet, with the genetics held constant, they converged anyway. On names, on timing, on the small, specific print of a life neither of them was consciously building to match. Whatever pulled two strangers toward the same beach and the same brand of cigarette wasn't a shared environment doing its work. It had nothing to do with either family at all. So the comfortable story that you are the product of your upbringing, carefully shaped by the people who raised you, was never quite true. But the colder story isn't true either. The one where you were written in advance by your genes with no say in the matter at all. You were built by genetics, and by a string of private, unrepeatable moments nobody else in your family was ever there for. Moments your own siblings couldn't have shared even if they'd tried, no matter how close the four walls around you were. Half of who you are was decided before you were born. The other half was decided in rooms your own brothers and sisters never once walked into.